There are places in the Appalachian Mountains where the forest grows too close together, where branches twist into thick canopies that swallow the light, where mist lingers long after sunrise, where sound does not travel the way it should. In those places, a shouted name feels muted, a snapped twig echoes too far, and silence feels intentional. The people who lived in the mountains understood this instinctively. They didn't discuss it openly, but they respected it the way one respects deep water or unstable ground. You learned where to walk, where not to linger, and what not to question. Red Hollow was one of those places. It wasn't a town, not really, just a loose scattering of cabins tucked between ridges and trees. In the autumn of 1904, only 7 families lived there. No proper road led in or out. No telegraph line connected them to the outside world. Communication happened slowly, carried by horse, by foot, or by memory. The trails that connected the cabins were narrow, worn into the earth by decades of passing boots and wagon wheels. They twisted between dense trees and steep slopes, disappearing easily when fog rolled in or leaves fell heavy across the ground. People in Red Hollow were not unfriendly. They helped each other when storms came. They shared harvest work. They gathered at the small church on Sundays. But they also kept their distance. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Yet, there were boundaries that went unspoken. You didn't linger too long on someone else's land. You didn't wander after sunset without reason. And you certainly didn't spend time near the far edge of the hollow unless you had to. Because that was where the Carter family lived. Their cabin sat at the outermost edge of Red Hollow, where the forest thickened and the land dipped slightly downward into darker ground. It was an older structure than most of the others. The timber was dark with age. The roof sagged just enough to show its years. Smoke stained the stones of the chimney black. There was one small window facing the tree line, not toward the other cabins, not toward the path, but directly toward the woods. The cabin did not look abandoned. It did not look dangerous. It simply felt separate. Inside lived Jonah Carter, his wife Eliza, and their 12-year-old twin daughters, Abigail Carter, Ruth Carter. Identical in face, identical in voice, identical in silence. The twins had been born on the same winter night, only minutes apart. From the beginning, they had been quiet children, not fragile, not sickly, just observant. As infants, they rarely cried. As toddlers, they rarely wandered. As young children, they rarely spoke, unless spoken to. At first, neighbors described them as polite, well-mannered, well-raised. But as years passed, that description began to shift. They were good girls, one neighbor would later say, just too still sometimes. The twins didn't run through the fields with the other children, didn't raise their voices during play, didn't argue the way siblings usually did. When one moved, the other often followed. When one turned her head, the other did as well. When one spoke, the other listened without interruption. There was no obvious hostility between them, no jealousy, no competition. Instead, there was a quiet coordination that unsettled people, without them fully understanding why. By the autumn of 1904, most of the adults in Red Hollow had grown accustomed to it. You don't question what you see every day. You simply adjust to it. But something else began to draw attention. the twins spent a great deal of time near the tree line, not wandering deep into the woods, not exploring, not playing, just standing at the edge where the clearing ended and the forest began. Sometimes they stood side by side, sometimes a step apart, sometimes holding hands, sometimes not. They rarely spoke when they stood there. They simply watched. Always the woods. Jonah Carter noticed it, of course. Any father would. But he dismissed it the same way most parents dismiss unsettling behavior, as a phase. Children changed. Children went through strange habits. That was normal. Eliza noticed it too. She noticed everything. She noticed how the girls sometimes fell silent when she entered a room, how their heads turned toward the door at the same moment when someone approached the cabin, how they occasionally sat awake in the dim light of the lamp at night, eyes open, listening to something she could not hear. Once, she asked them gently what they were listening for. The girls looked at her. Their expressions were calm, not confused, not fearful. "We're not listening," Abigail said quietly. "We're waiting," Ruth added. Eliza did not ask what they were waiting for. As the weeks passed, neighbors began to notice smaller things. The way the twins sometimes stood at the window, watching the trees instead of the path. The way they didn't respond immediately when called, as though they had to be brought back from somewhere else. The way the air in the clearing felt heavier when they were outside. No one said it aloud, but people began to avoid passing the Carter cabin after dark. Not out of fear, not consciously, just instinct. By late October, the hollow had grown quieter. The leaves had fallen. The air had cooled. Fog settled earlier in the evenings and stayed longer in the mornings. Sound carried strangely between the trees. On certain nights, people noticed the absence of familiar things. No insects, no distant animal calls, no movement in the brush. On those nights, more than one person claimed to see the same thing from their porch or doorway. Two small figures at the edge of the Carter clearing, standing perfectly still, facing the woods, not speaking, not moving, as though they were not watching the forest, but waiting for something within it to finally respond. The shift began slowly. That is always how it happens. Not with a moment, not with a scream, not with something that demands attention. It begins with small things, the kind of changes that can be explained away, the kind that only become frightening once you realize how long they've been happening. Eliza Carter was the first to sense it. She could not have named the change if asked. There was no single incident she could point to, no argument, no illness, no event that marked a clear before and after. But mothers notice patterns. They notice rhythms. And when those rhythms break, something inside them tightens. The girls had always been close. That was never unusual. Twins often are. They had always shared glances, finished each other's thoughts, preferred each other's company to anyone else's. But this was different. They had stopped arguing, not gradually, not with maturity, but completely. Children argue over toys, over chores, over nothing at all. It is part of how they learn boundaries, part of how they become separate people. Abigail and Ruth no longer did. If one wanted the chair by the fire, the other stood without hesitation. If one reached for the bread, the other withdrew her hand at the exact same moment. If one turned, the other followed. There was no negotiation, no discussion, no visible decision, just coordination. Eliza began noticing how often the girls mirrored one another, not like children playing at imitation, laughing as they copied each other's gestures. This was quieter, more exact. When one tilted her head, the other tilted hers at the same angle. When one paused at the threshold, the other stopped with her foot mid-step. When one blinked slowly, the other blinked in perfect rhythm. Sometimes, Eliza would watch them from across the room and feel as though she were looking at a reflection instead of two daughters. She tried, once, to separate them, not forcefully, just gently. Small errands, simple excuses. Ruth, come help me with the washing. Abigail, stay here with your father. Normal things, ordinary parenting. But something strange happened when they were apart. The girl who remained behind grew still, not upset, not angry, just vacant. Her eyes would drift toward the door, toward the window, towards the trees beyond the glass. Her body remained present, but something about her attention felt distant. Once, Jonah tried speaking to Ruth while Abigail was outside, chopping kindling. "Ruth," he said gently, "fetch me the lantern, would you?" She did not respond. He raised his voice slightly. "Ruth," still nothing. Only when Abigail stepped back inside did Ruth blink, as though waking, and immediately turned toward her sister. "I'll get it," she said quietly. Then she walked to the shelf and retrieved the lantern without further prompting. Jonah did not mention it again. He told himself what people always tell themselves when confronted with discomfort, that it was nothing, that it had a reasonable explanation, that it would pass. Twins are strange, people said. That's just nature's way. But the neighbors began noticing things too. It started with timing. People would see the girls at the tree line just before sunset, always before dark, standing still, facing the woods. At first, it looked like ordinary behavior. Children wander, children daydream, children linger where they shouldn't. But as days passed, the pattern sharpened. Always together, always silent, always in the same place, not walking, not exploring, not chasing each other, just standing. And sometimes, after the sun had dipped low enough to darken the forest floor, they would still be there. Two small figures in pale dresses, barely moving, barely breathing, not watching the woods, listening. That was how one neighbor described it later, not watching. Listening. It unsettled people in ways they struggled to explain. No one accused the girls of wrongdoing. No one suggested they were dangerous. But instinct is not logical. It does not argue. It does not present evidence. It simply warns. A farmer named Thomas Wilkes once passed the Carter property late in the evening, taking a shortcut home after helping another family mend a broken fence. He later claimed the twins were standing at the tree line as he approached. He tipped his hat politely, as was customary. "Evening, girls." They did not respond. He slowed his horse slightly, looked at them more closely. Their faces were calm, their eyes open, but they were not looking at him. They were looking past him, into the woods. He followed their gaze, expecting to see a deer, or maybe a bear, but there was nothing. Only trees, only shadows. When he looked back at the girls, he said something about their posture made his chest tighten. They weren't waiting on something to come out, he would later say. Looked more like something already there. And and they was listening to it. He rode the rest of the way home without looking back. Inside the Carter cabin, Eliza began having trouble sleeping, not because of nightmares, not because of sounds, because of the absence of them. On certain nights, when the fire burned low and the wind died completely, the silence inside the cabin felt unnatural, thick, pressing, as though the air itself were holding its breath. On those nights, she would sometimes open her eyes and see both girls sitting upright in their bed, not speaking, not moving, just staring toward the small window facing the woods. Once, gathering her courage, she whispered into the darkness, "What are you girls doing?" There was a pause, a long one. Then Abigail spoke softly. "We're listening." "For what?" Eliza asked. This time it was Ruth who answered. "For when it starts again." Eliza did not ask what it was. Somewhere deep inside, she already feared the answer. October 3rd, 1904, began like any other day for the Carter family. Jonah Carter, the sturdy and practical head of the household, saddled his horse just before sunrise and rode toward the nearest town. His purpose was simple: trade supplies, bring back food, and tend to errands that kept the small, isolated cabin running. The morning air was crisp, the kind that bites at the cheeks and fills the lungs with a sharp clarity, and the woods surrounding the path were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Back at the cabin, Eliza Carter, the mother of the household, moved about her chores, humming softly to herself as she fed the animals and tidied the small kitchen. The twins, young girls of a peculiar calm, were nowhere near the window to wave goodbye. There was a sense of normalcy, of routine, a morning like any other, or so it seemed. That afternoon, well before Jonah returned, a visitor arrived. Eliza's sister, Marion, had come without warning, unannounced. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps coincidence, but the unease that hit her as she approached the cabin was immediate. The air seemed heavier here, as though the walls themselves held a secret. She stepped inside cautiously. The scene that greeted her froze her in place. There, at the kitchen table, sat the twins, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed unwaveringly on an open Bible. But they were not reading, not in the way a child might follow along with a story. Their gaze was vacant, intense, almost otherworldly, resting on the page as if it held some invisible force. Marion took a step closer, and it was then she noticed it. The page itself was marked charcoal, heavy, almost violent strokes, repeating a single verse over and over again. For there are voices that are not seen, and footsteps that leave no trace. The words were dark, the pressure so deep, the paper had begun to tear along the marks. It was the repetition that unnerved her more than the words themselves. This was not casual writing. This was obsession, ritual, something that seemed far beyond the understanding of children. Her eyes drifted away from the Bible, scanning the rest of the room. The walls, once plain and ordinary, now bore strange etchings, thin, precise lines carved meticulously into the wood, hundreds of them, forming repeating patterns that seemed deliberate, intentional. They were symbols almost, but not quite. Something in their arrangement made the hair on the back of Marion's neck stand up. They weren't simple scratches. They were messages or warnings. She couldn't tell which. Summoning all her courage, she asked the question that had formed immediately in her mind. Who did this? The twins' response was immediate, calm, synchronized. Their voices, in perfect unison, cut through the room with an unnatural clarity. We didn't. No hesitation, no stammer, just certainty. Marian blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. "You didn't?" She pressed gently, trying to mask the tremor in her own voice. Again, the reply came without a hint of doubt. "We didn't." And that was all. No further explanation, no attempt to justify or clarify. They simply sat there, silent and still, as if the question itself were absurd. Marian's gaze shifted back to the markings. Something about the patterns tugged at her intuition. It wasn't merely the etchings, nor the repeated verse in the Bible. It was a combination of both. Children, the writing, the carved symbols on the walls, all of it seemed to speak of something unseen, something waiting just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The verse itself lingered in Marian's mind like a shadow that refused to fade. Voices that are not seen. Footsteps that leave no trace. It was a warning, or perhaps a prophecy. Either way, it carried weight far beyond the age of the girls who had written it. And yet, it was clear the twins had not written it. Not in any way that could be explained by human logic. Eliza returned later that day to find her sister pale and uneasy, staring at the Bible. "It's nothing," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed the strain of doubt. "I don't know what's come over them." But Marian knew better. She had seen the certainty in their eyes, the unnatural stillness in their posture. She had seen the deliberate chaos etched into the very walls of the cabin. Whatever had taken hold of the twins was not something ordinary. It was deliberate, calculated, and it was waiting, patient, perhaps even watching. Jonah Carter returned that evening, unsuspecting. The quiet, the marks, the repetitive verse, all of it would have to be confronted. But how do you confront the inexplicable? How do you respond to the knowledge that something unseen, something beyond comprehension, is already inside your home, watching, waiting? That night, the Carter household was forever changed. The twins continued to sit by the Bible, silent, their eyes tracing the page. The marks on the walls caught the candlelight, casting shadows that seemed to shift on their own. And in the darkness of the small cabin, the words repeated themselves over and over again, a chant that was not of this world. For there are voices that are not seen, and footsteps that leave no trace. It was a verse meant to be felt, to be feared. And as Marian left the cabin that night, she understood that nothing would ever be the same for the Carters. Something had touched the children, something that defied explanation. And its presence lingered like a whisper in the shadows, unseen, yet undeniably there. Jonah Carter rode into the fading light, returning from town well after the sun had sunk below the horizon. The sky was a dark, bruised purple, the kind that presses down on the chest and carries the weight of unspoken dread. As he approached the cabin, he expected the usual welcome, the warmth of the fire, the smell of cooking, the chatter of his daughters, or at least the calm presence of Eliza moving about inside. What he found instead unsettled him at once. The fire was lit, casting a flickering glow across the small wooden walls. The pot on the stove was still warm, the stew inside simmering gently, as though someone had just stepped away. The cabin door was closed, latched, as it always was at night. But the twins, his daughters, were nowhere to be seen. Jonah dismounted, and stepped cautiously into the cabin, calling their names. The words echoed off the walls, swallowed by the silence. He checked the beds, the corners, the small cupboard where the girls sometimes hid while playing. Nothing. No whispers, no giggles, no sign of life. There had been no struggle, no overturned furniture, no signs of a break-in, no splintered wood, no broken locks. The floor was immaculate. Even the dirt tracked in from the surrounding woods was absent. It was as if the girls had simply vanished. But two things immediately caught Jonah's eye. The first were the shoes, two identical pairs, small, neatly placed side by side beside the hearth. Polished leather, tied carefully, as though someone had deliberately removed them and set them down. They were empty, hollow shells of what should have been worn by living children. The precision of their placement suggested intention, care. It was a careful, almost ritualistic gesture, and Jonah felt an unfamiliar chill run down his spine. The second was Eliza. She was seated in the corner, huddled close to herself, her back rigid against the wall. Alive, yes. Breathing, yes. But hollow. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, her hands motionless in her lap. When Jonah stepped closer, she did not flinch, did not respond to his voice. It was as though she had been drained of her humanity, reduced to a shell of fear and something deeper, something unspoken. Before neighbors could gather, whispering and curious, Eliza began murmuring, almost as if speaking to someone only she could see. The words were the same over and over, repeated with a mechanical, haunting rhythm. They came back before they left. They came back before they left. They came back before they left. Each repetition was quieter than the last, yet no less insistent. Jonah and the villagers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words pressing against them like a physical force. What could she mean? How could someone, or something, return before it had even left? As the night deepened, search parties formed, moving cautiously into the surrounding woods. Lanterns cast trembling circles of light over twisted roots and fallen branches. Horses whinnied nervously at the edge of the trees. Every rustle of leaves or snapping of twigs was met with startled silence. But no tracks were found, nothing. No torn clothing, no traces of struggle, no signs that wild animals had been involved. The forest seemed pristine, untouched, almost as if it were shielding a terrible secret. And yet, there was one thing, one undeniable clue. Bare footprints, small, child-sized. They led from the shadowed forest towards the cabin, imprinting the soft earth as if the girls had returned by some impossible path. The footprints were faint but deliberate, perfectly formed, as though made by someone or something that knew exactly where to go. The villagers followed them cautiously. The trail ended at the cabin steps, disappearing entirely as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Whispers rose among the gathered crowd. How could footprints appear without the children themselves? How could they lead to a place where no one had yet set foot? The questions hung heavy in the autumn air, unanswered, impossible. Inside, Eliza continued to whisper her mantra, unblinking, her voice low but insistent. The twins' absence, the empty shoes, the mysterious footprints. It was all a puzzle too sinister to solve. Even Jonah, practical, grounded and used to the hardships of frontier life, felt the creeping horror of helplessness. Something had touched his daughters that night, something beyond the realm of understanding, something that defied time, space, and reason. As the night pressed on, Jonah watched the empty chairs at the table, the 2 pairs of shoes, and the shadows dancing across the walls. A silence, heavier than anything he had ever known, settled over the cabin, and somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered through the trees as if carrying the echo of his daughter's laughter, or perhaps their cries. No one would sleep that night. No one could, not with the image of the footprints burned into their minds, not with Eliza's hollow eyes, and not with the relentless, haunting words. They came back before they left, and the forest waited, patient, silent, watching. The official search for the Carter twins ended after 2 weeks. The men from neighboring settlements returned to their farms. The lanterns were extinguished. The horses were unhitched. The careful grids drawn across forest maps were folded and put away. The sheriff declared what no one wanted to hear. There was no evidence left to follow. But unofficially, the search never ended, because after the search party stopped, the sightings began. The first report came from a farmer who lived along the eastern ridge, a hard-working man known for his sobriety and common sense. He claimed that just before dusk, as the sun bled into the hills, he saw 2 girls standing at the crest of the ridge, side by side, perfectly still, watching, not waving, not calling out, not moving, just standing there long enough for unease to settle in his stomach like a stone. By the time he blinked and raised his lantern, they were gone. No sound, no movement, no trace. He told himself it was imagination. Grief can do strange things to a community. Fear can invent shapes in the distance. So he said nothing. Until the second report. A hunter returning late one evening swore he heard children laughing behind him on the trail. Soft laughter, close, familiar, the kind that sends warmth through the chest and memories rushing to the surface. He smiled at first. Then he remembered. There were no children left near the woods at night anymore, not after what had happened. He stopped walking. The laughter stopped too. Slowly, he turned around, heart pounding. The path behind him was empty. No footprints, no broken twigs, no sign of life. Only silence and the terrible certainty that someone had been standing close enough to breathe on his neck. Then came the report no one wanted to repeat aloud. A young mother from the neighboring settlement claimed she heard whispering outside her window just after midnight. Not wind, not animals, voices, soft, patient, calling her child's name, not once, not twice, over and over again. She lay frozen beneath her blankets, listening. The voices were calm, gentle, almost polite, as though whatever stood outside was not in a hurry, as though it already knew it would eventually be answered. By morning, she found small bare footprints in the dirt beneath her window. 2 sets. Always 2. That became the detail no one could ignore. Every story, every sighting, every whisper carried the same pattern. 2 girls, 2 voices, 2 figures, always together, always calm, never running, never frantic, never afraid, and always followed by the same sensation, the certainty of being watched. At first, people assumed it came from the woods, from the darkness between the trees, from the ridgelines and the long shadows stretching across empty fields. That would have made sense. That would have been easier to accept. But those who experienced it firsthand described something far worse. They didn't feel watched from outside. They felt watched from inside their homes, inside their rooms, inside the quiet moments between breaths. Men reported waking in the middle of the night with the undeniable feeling that someone was standing beside their beds, not moving, not touching, just present, waiting. When they reached for lanterns, nothing was there, but the air felt disturbed, as though something had only just stepped away. Children began refusing to sleep alone, not because of nightmares, not because of shadows, but because, they said, the girls stand too close to the bed. When asked which girls, they could never explain. They only said, the quiet ones. The Carter twins were never named directly in these stories. No one needed to. Everyone already knew. Some claimed they saw the girls near the old cabin, not entering, not leaving, only standing at the tree line, watching the dark shape of the home that no one lived in anymore. Those who approached never got close. Something in the air would turn their legs heavy, their thoughts fogged, their instincts screaming to turn back. And always, just before they did, they would notice the same detail. The girls' feet were bare, not dirty, not bruised, not cold, just bare, resting lightly against the earth, as though they barely needed to touch it at all. The whispers grew more frequent, the sightings more precise. People began locking doors earlier, shuttering windows before sunset, praying longer at night. Still, it didn't help, because the feeling did not come from outside the walls. It came from within them, from the corners of rooms, from the space behind shoulders, from the silence just before sleep. As though whatever wore the shape of two little girls no longer needed the woods, no longer needed the trails, no longer needed the night. It had learned the way in, and somewhere, deep in the collective fear of the community, one realization began to take hold, not spoken aloud, but understood all the same. The twins had not disappeared. They had changed. And whatever they had become was no longer waiting outside. 8 years had passed since the Carter twins vanished from the sight of the townsfolk in Red Hollow. The stories, whispered in corners and around hearths, had settled into local legend, half forgotten by some, and yet carried in the quiet dread of others. The woods around the small settlement remained the same, dense, shadowed, and patient, but the memory of the twins lingered like smoke that refused to dissipate. In 1912, a traveling school teacher named Harold Whitcomb arrived in Red Hollow. He was young, meticulous, and curious, with a habit of documenting everything he observed in a small, leather-bound journal. His purpose was simple: record local folklore, catalog stories, and preserve traditions that might otherwise vanish. The villagers were hesitant to speak with him at first. The story of the Carter twins was one they did not share lightly, and they avoided the woods even during the brightest hours of day. Whitcomb, however, was persistent. He wrote daily, detailing the landscape, the people, and the tales they carried. On November 17th, he made a note that would mark the first time in years the twins were mentioned in his writings. Villagers speak of twin girls who never aged, seen sometimes near the tree line, always watching, never approaching. The phrasing unsettled Whitcomb. Never approaching, he wrote in the margin. What could it mean to watch without moving? What is the purpose of a gaze that never rests? He returned to the tree line that evening, curious and unsettled in equal measure. The air had taken on that familiar chill, the kind that raises goosebumps on the back of the neck without warning. As he walked, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending across the ground, as though the sun itself were trying to flee. 3 nights later, on November 20th, Whitcomb wrote his final entry in the journal. His handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, almost as though the pen was moving faster than his hand could control. Saw them myself tonight. 2 figures standing beyond the fence. Same face, same posture. They did not move when I spoke, only tilted their heads in perfect unison. He paused here, pen hovering, as if the act of recording the sighting was both a confession and a warning. The figures he had seen were unmistakable. 2 girls, identical in every feature, their presence unnerving yet undeniably deliberate. They did not walk toward him, nor did they flee. They simply existed, observing with a calm, almost unnatural patience that made the air feel thick and heavy. Whitcomb described the sensation in careful yet panicked detail. Their eyes, he wrote, held the depth of centuries, as though they were not merely seeing, but understanding, analyzing the world in ways impossible for ordinary children. When he spoke, they responded not with words, but with a tilt of the head. A synchronized, deliberate gesture, 2 minds in harmony, communicating silently across the gap of space and time. Finally, he wrote one sentence that would end the journal. I believe they are listening through us. The words are stark, haunting, and leave the reader with a sensation of intrusion, as though the twins had not only observed the village for years, but had somehow infiltrated the very consciousness of those who saw them. Whitcomb's note implies a shift, subtle but terrifying. The girls were no longer merely watching. They were perceiving, understanding, and influencing from a distance. The next morning, Whitcomb left Red Hollow quietly, without farewells. He packed his journals, his belongings, and his fear, and disappeared down the winding road leading out of the valley. He never mentioned the twins again in any of his writings or correspondence. Friends later asked if he had seen something remarkable during his travels. Whitcomb would nod sometimes, but never elaborate. The terror he had felt that night was locked away in that small leather-bound journal, hidden from the world. Over the years, other visitors occasionally spoke of strange encounters, small footprints near abandoned structures, fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line. But none were as detailed or as chilling as Whitcomb's account. The twins had become a legend, not only for their disappearance, but for the uncanny sense of being observed, an invisible presence that could not be escaped. Red Hollow itself slowly aged. Houses were built, barns repaired, paths widened, but the stories persisted, carried on the whispers of those who had lived through the events of 1904 and beyond. Children were warned not to wander near the old cabin, not to approach the tree line, and not to ignore the feeling of eyes on them, even when no one was there. Whitcomb's journal remains one of the few concrete records of what the outsiders could never explain. 2 girls who refused to grow, 2 figures whose presence transcended time, and a certainty that wherever they were listening, watching, and waiting. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of the woods, beyond the fence, 2 identical figures still stand, motionless, calm, observing the world through eyes that know more than they should, tilting their heads in perfect unison at anyone daring enough to notice. The last known encounter was not the end. It was merely another beginning. Red Hollow did not vanish all at once. It faded slowly, like a candle burning down over decades. Families packed what little they owned and left behind cabins that once held laughter. Roofs caved in, windows shattered. Trails that once connected neighbors were swallowed by vines and roots. The forest reclaimed everything with quiet patience. But long after the last wagon rolled away, the unease remained. Even now, locals avoid that stretch of woods, not because of superstition, they insist, not because of stories, but because of experience, the kind you don't forget. Hikers passing through the outskirts of what used to be Red Hollow sometimes report strange sensations. It begins subtly, a change in the air, a heaviness behind the eyes, the feeling that the forest is no longer something you are walking through, but something that is watching you move. At first, it's just the footsteps. A person will hear them behind them on the trail. Not branches snapping randomly, not the scurry of small animals, but footsteps that match their own. When they walk, the sound follows. When they stop, it stops. When they shift their weight, the sound shifts too. Many convince themselves it's imagination until they test it. They take a step, pause, take another, pause again. The echo repeats with impossible accuracy, not delayed, not distorted, perfectly mirrored, as if someone is copying them in real time. Some turn around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever is playing the trick. The trail is always empty, no movement, no birds scattering, no sign that another person has been there at all. And yet, the sensation lingers. They are not alone. Then there is the laughter, not loud, not playful in the way living children laugh, but soft, distant, almost thoughtful. It drifts between the trees like fog, without direction, without source. People describe it as beautiful at first, nostalgic, the kind of sound that reminds you of childhood, safety, innocence, until it goes on too long, until you realize the tone never changes, never rises, never falls. The same pattern, repeated again and again, like something that learned the sound but never learned the meaning. That is usually when the fear begins. But the most unsettling reports are not about sounds. They are about the feeling. The one no one knows how to describe without their voice dropping lower, not being followed, being mirrored. Hikers say it feels as though something is walking where they walk, standing where they stand, pausing when they pause. Not behind them, not ahead of them, but alongside them. Just out of view, just beyond the edge of perception, like a reflection that does not belong to a mirror. Some report catching movement in the corner of their eye, a shift between the trees, a pale shape, a suggestion of two figures standing far too still for anything alive. When they look directly, there's nothing there, just forest, just shadow, just silence. Others claim they have seen them clearly. Two figures standing between the trees, side by side, perfectly still, no sound, no motion, no attempt to approach, just watching. Those who see them rarely describe fear in the moment. Instead, they describe calm, a strange, unnatural calm that settles over the body like a heavy blanket. The instinct to run disappears. The instinct to call out vanishes. All that remains is the awareness of being observed with an attention that feels older than thought. Then, almost always, they notice the details. The figures are too symmetrical, too synchronized, too alike. Same height, same posture, same tilt of the head, as if they are not two beings, but one presence split into two shapes. And when the hikers blink, when they look away for even a moment, the figures are gone. No sound of retreat, no rustling of leaves, no breaking of branches, just absence. Park rangers assigned to the wider region have unofficial rules they never write down. Don't set up camps near the old trail. Don't investigate reports of voices in the trees after sunset. Don't respond to calls that seem to come from deeper in the forest than they should. And above all, don't follow barefoot footprints, because occasionally, after rain, small tracks appear on the paths. Not animal, not adult, child-sized, light impressions, as though whoever made them barely pressed against the earth. 2 sets, always 2. They don't lead deeper into the woods. They lead toward the trail, toward the road, toward wherever people still walk. Red Hollow may be gone, its buildings reduced to rot and memory, but something remains, something that did not leave with the families, something that did not age, did not fade, did not forget, not ghosts, not legends, not stories, but watchers, patient, silent, learning. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: the twins are no longer confined to Red Hollow. They are simply the place where people first noticed them. And somewhere, right now, in some quiet forest, where the trees grow too close together, 2 figures may be standing side by side, perfectly still, listening to footsteps that do not belong to them, waiting for someone to notice. Some believe the Carter twins were taken by the woods. Others believe something far worse, that they were never taken at all. They were simply replaced. And whatever walks those mountains now still answers to their names.